This is the final video in this series. In this video, we're going to look at the final years after the war, as well as just giving some final concluding remarks on what Stalin did for the Soviet Union and how he should be remembered. The 9th of May marks Victory Day and is one of the biggest celebrations still in Russia. It marks the end of the darkest days in Russian history. It was this day that the whole nation broke into mass celebration, for after 4 dark years, they had finally gotten peace. The war had devastating impact on the country, and now that the war was over, the country had to be rebuilt. All the buildings, farms, and other infrastructure was all destroyed. All parts of the Soviet economy that allowed people to be able to eat and live a decent standard of living were also now destroyed, leaving the Soviet people with essentially nothing. Over 20 million people from the Soviet Union died, and people who died were the most hard-working, devoted, and loyal communists, as they were the ones who first joined the war and fought with the least hesitation on the front lines. The entire pre-war Communist Party was destroyed. More than half the pre-war Communist Party died during the war. It was then the most bureaucratic and careeristic members of the party who survived and now made up the majority of the party. While the pre-war party was made up of mostly workers and peasants, the party was now made up of white-collar bureaucrats. To make things even worse, many of the new party members had very little or no knowledge in Marxist theory. They had very little knowledge in even the party's history, understanding of politics, or any theory. Stalin and others recognized this problem and realized that they must do something to combat these emerging tendencies in the party. In 1947, there was a proposition for a new party program as the country was moving into a lower stage of communism. The party program had the following: A. To implement universal voting and decision-making on the majority of the most important questions of governmental life in both the social and economic spheres, as well as in questions of living conditions and cultural development. B. To widely develop legislative initiative from below, by means of granting to social organizations the right to submit to the Supreme Soviet proposals for new legislation. C. To confirm the right of citizens and social organizations to directly submit proposals to the Supreme Soviet on the most important questions of international and internal policy. In short, this would have shifted the power away from mid-level managers and politicians directly to the workers, who are now literate and educated enough to run all of society. Unfortunately, the party bureaucracy postponed the Congress from 1948 to 1952, where this proposal would be discussed. The local bureaucrats demanded unquestionable loyalty from the people. The spirit of democracy was lost, and you did not even see the same level of criticism of local bureaucrats as you did in the 20s or 30s. What made it even harder to fight the party bureaucrats was the fact that a large focus at the time was on post-war reconstruction, as the people's lives were still in ruin from the war, and so the Soviet population was more concerned with rebuilding than the fact that there was a higher level of corruption amongst local bureaucrats. The bureaucrats knew they couldn't keep this going forever. They knew they couldn't keep these new democratic reforms from being passed. Eventually, as they began finding out Stalin was planning a new purge of the party bureaucracy. The purge and the reforms, however, were not carried through due to Stalin dying shortly after. Stalin himself died under very suspicious circumstances. While there is no evidence that Stalin and Zhdanov, Stalin's ally who proposed the party congress to be in 1947 or 1948 and proposed a law of the democratic reforms, were murdered. The motives for the murder by the bureaucrats was definitely there. Zhdanov himself was only 52 years old. The death of these two was either murder or was one of the luckiest coincidences for the bureaucrats. After Stalin's death, Khrushchev was able to rally the bureaucrats around him, securing power for the bureaucrats and denouncing Stalin and removing any true communists trying to oppose the new leadership of the careerists and bureaucrats. Through the whole of Stalin's life, we can see that he truly believed in communism and devoted his whole life to the cause. He would risk everything to fight against the status quo of the Tsar, and once he gained power, he devoted his whole life to developing the Soviet Union. He is remembered by the rapid industrialization that he brought to the country. People remember how poor they were before Stalin and what Stalin did to improve their living standards. They underwent the fastest industrialization of the time, and because of this, they were able to defeat the Nazis. Stalin is remembered most of all for saving them from the Nazis as a war hero. If it wasn't for him, the Nazis would have likely killed every single Slavic person in the East. That is why, after all the propaganda in Russia today, who are not ideologically communist, people still remember Stalin as a hero. His legacy is also marked as one of the most democratic, if not the most democratic, countries to date. The so-called authoritarianism you hear about was targeted against the party bureaucracy, not the people. We can learn a lot from the political system under Stalin's USSR, as the Soviet Union under Stalin managed to keep a good balance of not falling into one-sidedness and having for every level of decentralization, centralization at another level. One-sided decentralization, which is so popular among the libertarians, leads to nothing but submission to the status quo and the deep state. Then one-sided centralization, as popular by dogmatic Marxist-Leninists, leads to the corruption of the government and ruling party elites. This is why Khrushchev's decentralization policies and Brezhnev's centralization policies both lead to the same results, and it was only under Stalin's leadership that the Soviets were able to carry the correct road to socialism. It was because of this dialectic that Stalin realized and balanced that he was so feared and hated by Soviet bureaucrats, because they knew as long as Stalin was alive, he would never let them consolidate power and would always hold their corruption accountable to the people, and why the elites make up such lies about him, because his very legacy threatens their power. All good people who make radical shifts in the status quo to a better society will always have tons of propaganda and lies thrown so that the power of the elites cannot be challenged. Just as how Nelson Mandela was called a terrorist, Martin Luther King was called a spy, and Rosa Parks called a criminal. The same lies have been told for Stalin. Stalin said, "I know that after my death, a pile of rubbish will be heaped up on my grave, but the wind of history will sooner or later sweep it away without mercy." We can see that Stalin's prediction came true. After his death, the establishment spread a bunch of lies about Stalin. The truth will prevail though, and now it is time for the wind to come through.